Hello, and welcome to this video essay looking at Paul Gauguin, viewing his late paintings through an intersectional analysis combining the male gaze, post-colonialism, and Orientalism. Eugène-Henri Paul Gauguin was a post-impressionist painter who was involved in the development of the synthetist and primitivist styles towards the end of the 19th century. Relatively unsuccessful during his life, his posthumous popularity can be attributed to the efforts of his art dealer Ambroise Voillard, who also financially supported him towards the end of his life. He spent the last years of his life living and painting in Tahiti and the Marquesas Islands in French Polynesia. He died here, financially destitute and in trouble with the authorities from syphilis, aged 54. Gauguin's travels to French Polynesia were influenced by his desire to escape what he saw as the unnatural Western way of living, and due to his dissatisfaction at the French art establishment's lack of appreciation of his work. He saw Polynesia as exemplifying the primitive idyll he desired to escape to. His initial efforts to find this were in vain. He found Tahiti already too impacted, in his eyes, ruined by European culture. He ultimately settled in the Marquesas Islands, which he had heard described of as the life he desired. However, when he arrived, he found it decimated by European disease and under the full control of Catholic missionaries, much to his dismay. While in French Polynesia, Gauguin had affairs with at least local women, the oldest of whom was 14, having at least 4 children, none of whom he helped to raise. This video essay will consider a number of Gauguin's later works and present an analysis of the visual elements, which can then be contrasted against those in his earlier works. These analyses can then be considered within an intersectional framework, which include elements from the male gaze, Orientalism, and post-colonialism, and looking at how his images of Polynesian women convey not only his patriarchal views, but also his colonial outlook. But first, we'll define some terms. Orientalism is the way the West sees Asia, often in an inferior way to them. This is highly intertwined with colonialism. Post-colonialism is the idea that we should rethink the subordination of people and cultures under various forms of imperialism. For example, the British Empire or the French in French Polynesia. Moving on, we'll also use the idea of the male gaze, which Mulvey defined in 1975, referring to film, and she says that the male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure. This will become useful when analysing some of Gauguin's later works. Primitivism is a style that Gauguin painted much of his late work in, and it's art that has elements and styles of tribal objects and other non-Western art forms. Behind this movement was a Western fascination with distant lands, especially those seen to be less civilized. Much of this fascination was based around the idea that these cultures had retained their intrinsic goodness of humanity, was based on the French philosopher Rousseau's idea of the noble savage. Also, people saw these cultures as lacking the Western repression of sexual desire, which they found attractive. This has now become seen as an outdated and degrading form of art. Further discussion of Gauguin's work in the field will be conducted later in this essay. The first piece of art from Gauguin we will look at is Contes Barbares, which translates to Primitive Tales. It was painted a year before Gauguin's death in the Marquesas Islands. It shows 2 young Marquesan women and one of Gauguin's friends from France, Maya de Haan, who was dead by the time the painting was started and in fact never visited French Polynesia. De Haan is pictured almost as a devil, with his arresting gaze and almost talon-like toenails, showing him as a malignant entity in the picture. He is juxtaposed with Marquesans, whose gazes are gentle and whose nudity shows them the submissive force in the painting. Conventionally, such as in the work of Perret in 2013, academics are of the opinion that the depiction of de Haan is Gauguin's criticism of the West and its established religion. De Haan, a Jew, is stereotypically depicted as the embodiment of how Gauguin saw the West as morally corrupt and decadent. His eyes are green with envy of the lives of the women, which are shown as idyllic and peaceful, in contrast to how Gauguin found living in the West. The central woman is shown in a Buddha-like pose. Gauguin intends to convey the serenity and peace that he expected to find on the island and that he thought these people lived in. Indeed, in using the imagery of the Buddha, Gauguin homogenizes the Orient and their cultural symbols. This highlights the difference between how Gauguin saw himself as a defender and documenter of their way of life, and of their culture and their reality. However, not only does he actually not understand or respect it, he is actively part of its degradation. An alternative analysis of the painting, however, could be considered looking at it through Laura Mulvey's idea of the male gaze. Not only are the women in the painting nude and exposed to the viewer, highlighting that they are not only submissive to the painter and viewer, they are also submissive to Dahan, who could be seen behind them, almost biting his hand with undisguised sexual excitement about how the women in front of him appear. Most importantly, the women are shown in the painting only as a method of portraying Gauguin's opinions and political and social agenda, whereas Dahan, despite Gauguin's caricature of his features, retains his recognizable red hair and tachia. This is an example of what Mulvey writes, that women are the bearer of meaning and not the maker of meaning. Dahan retains his individuality and agency, whereas the women are reduced to be symbols for Gauguin's sexual and racial fantasies. Considering the two ideas presented previously, Comte Barbe can be compared to an 1885 painting by Gauguin, Women Bathing, painted in Dieppe. Considering the composition and colour palette of the paintings, they can be seen to be similar, a serene background with a number of women in the foreground and a man behind them. There are a number of similarities that can be considered. In the earlier painting, the women are either faceless or facing away from the viewer, making them anomalous symbols used by Gauguin as an artistic device, rather than them retaining their own humanity. This is emphasised by the mustachioed man behind them. Despite being further away, he is painted with recognisable features, retaining his own individuality and personality. This mirrors the discussion around the male gaze in Comte Barbe, where the women are also merely symbols used by Gauguin, unlike the men. However, there are obvious differences in the painting, the main one being how the women are presented. While the white women in the earlier painting are fully clothed, the Polynesian women are nude and exposed to the viewer. In addition, the man in Women Bathing ignores the women. He looks in entirely the different direction to them, in stark contrast to Dahan's wicked stare in Comte Barbe. This highlights Gauguin's fetishization of the Polynesians, beyond the misogyny he showed to all women, as evidenced by his life and art. Gauguin 2002 says that in a colonized nation, the local people and culture is romanticized, especially those in the Pacific. They continue, women are exoticized, the colonizer's gaze is directed at the local women, rendering them beautiful. This is obviously where much of Gauguin's inspiration in his later works come from, the movement from his early work in his synthetist phase, where the image was much more about allegory and the meaning conveyed through the art. However, his later work from Polynesia seems to shift. While much of it maintains this allegorical nature, the focus seems to move to the local people, especially the women, as blank canvases to convey his ideas. This can be seen obviously in two more of his works shown here. Whereas similarly, the 12 women envisioned after the sermon are used to simply represent the 12 children of Jacob, who in the Bible founded the 12 tribes of Israel. However, in the later work, while the women are used as an allegory of the passing of time and life, there remains a sense of Gauguin's fascination with them as objects of desire, on top of his use of them as symbols. Canuet's claim that colonization portrays stereotypical Pacific Islander women, bare-breasted, feeding men, having sex with them, is also substantiated by Gauguin's actions and paintings. He defines them by their physical attributes and the pleasure he can gain from them. Pilker writes that preserving and honouring Gauguin, while largely ignoring artists from the areas that he appropriated, contributes to the looming institution of French colonialism and creates an art world that privileges whiteness and Eurocentric narratives. I think that understanding Gauguin's importance in the development of two influential art movements, indeed Picasso was influenced by Gauguin. However, it must be placed within a context of his lack of respect for the cultures he took inspiration and often stole from, and his exploitation of people of those cultures. Ultimately, Gauguin's paintings are a product of his colonialist and patriarchal views, which informed his racial and sexual fantasies that are so obvious to the modern viewer in his paintings.